The house had a way of waking before I did. Not loudly, not with movement, just a subtle readiness, like a body holding its breath before opening its eyes. Pipes adjusted in the walls. The old refrigerator settled into a low, steady hum. Somewhere upstairs, wood responded to temperature, a soft sound that meant nothing unless you'd lived with it long enough to recognize its moods. I had lived there long enough. 18 years will teach you the difference between normal and almost normal, between silence that belongs to a place and silence that feels arranged. That morning, everything looked correct, and that was what unsettled me. I stood in the kitchen, barefoot on the cool tile, holding a mug that had already gone untouched long enough for the steam to fade. The light through the window hit the counter at the same shallow angle it always did. Outside, the street was still. No engines, no footsteps, no reason to believe anything had happened overnight. But the air felt handled, not stale, not disturbed, just aware of itself. I took a slow breath and told myself gently that age does this to people, that awareness sharpens not because danger increases, but because patience wears thin. You stop assuming safety, you start confirming it. I moved through the house as I always did, methodically, without rush. I passed the dining table and noticed the chair closest to the wall had been pushed in farther than usual. I paused there, fingers resting lightly on the back of it, searching my memory for when I might have done that. Nothing came. It wasn't dramatic enough to accuse. That was the problem. The house didn't look violated. It looked corrected, as if someone had noticed my habits and decided to improve them. I'm not careless with routine. Routine is how you notice absence. The hallway rug lay flat, its corner smoothed out. I never bothered fixing that corner. It always curled slightly, just enough to trip someone who wasn't paying attention. I'd learned to step over it years ago. That morning, it was perfect. I bent down and pressed my palm into it. The fibers sprang back, warm, recently compressed. Someone else had stepped there. The thought did not arrive with fear. It arrived with clarity. I straightened slowly and listened. Nothing answered. The house remained cooperative, obedient, quiet. That was when I understood the first truth. Though I didn't yet have language for it, whatever had happened had not been rushed. In the bathroom, I reached for my toothbrush and stopped. It was dry. I stared at it longer than necessary, the way you stare at a word you know well that suddenly looks misspelled. I was certain I had brushed my teeth before bed. Certain enough that doubt felt dishonest. Still, certainty does strange things when you're alone with it. I touched the bristles. Completely dry. No residual coolness. No moisture at the base. I didn't panic. Panic makes noise. Panic wants witnesses. Instead, I cataloged. That's what you do when fear hasn't fully decided whether to show itself. You turn sensation into information and hope it behaves. I checked the doors next. Front door, locked. Back door, bolted. Windows, latched. Nothing broken, nothing forced. The absence of damage narrowed the possibilities quickly and unpleasantly. Someone hadn't broken in. Someone had come in. Access changes everything. Access means history. Access means familiarity. Access means you don't need to hide because you don't expect resistance. I sat down on the edge of the bed and let that settle. My heart rate remained steady. My hands did not shake. That concerned me more than fear would have. By mid-morning, I found the study drawer. It was closed, properly aligned, not ajar in a way that would demand attention. But inside, the order was wrong. Papers stacked neatly, too neatly. Folders returned, but not in the sequence I used. A document placed upside down, as if someone had checked it quickly and dismissed it. Nothing was missing. I sat in the chair across from the desk and stared at the drawer for a long time. The realization formed slowly, reluctantly. This wasn't theft. This was examination. Someone had been looking for something specific and hadn't found it. That meant two things. They would come back, and next time, they might stay longer. I tried to remember who had keys, not who used to, who might still have access without me knowing. Family, of course, friends, neighbors, briefly, years ago. Then there were the people you don't immediately think of, the ones who never needed to ask twice, the ones who paid attention, the ones who treated your house like a shared space long after it stopped being one. A name surfaced. I pushed it away. Familiarity is persuasive. It convinces you that discomfort is exaggeration, and instinct is drama. It tells you that if danger were real, it would look different, louder, messier. My phone rang just after noon. It was my daughter. Her voice was bright in that careful way people use when they don't intend to listen very long. She talked about work first, then errands, then how quickly the week seemed to be moving. She did not ask how I was sleeping. That omission lodged itself somewhere behind my ribs. "Did you hear from Daniel?" she asked casually. The question came too easily. "No," I said. "Oh, he mentioned stopping by last week. Maybe he got the day wrong?" I said nothing. "He worries about you," she added quickly. "You know how he is." I did know how he was. That was the problem. I found the empty hiding place that evening. The decorative stone in the garden bed had been moved just enough to be convincing. Not careless, not rushed. Simply adjusted. The spare key was gone. Not dropped, not snapped off. Gone with intention. I stood there longer than necessary, replaying moments I had once dismissed as harmless. Comments, smiles, the way he had noticed things others hadn't. "You should hide it better," he'd said once, years ago. At the time, it had sounded like advice. Now, it sounded like rehearsal. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of noise, because of anticipation. The house felt like it was waiting. For footsteps, for breath, for permission. I lay still, listening to silence that no longer felt accidental. By morning, I knew one thing with certainty. Whatever this was, it had already passed the point of misunderstanding. And the worst part, the part I could no longer ignore, was this. The danger didn't feel unfamiliar. It felt personal. The first sound came at 1:42 a.m., not a step, not a door. Just the softest contact, like fingers testing whether a surface would respond if pressed gently enough. I didn't move. I've learned over the years that movement announces itself long before sound does. Breath changes. Sheets shift. The body betrays you even when you ask it not to. So I stayed still and listened. The sound did not repeat. That was almost worse. If someone were clumsy, they would have tried again. If they were uncertain, they would have retreated loudly. But whoever it was understood patience. They understood that stillness could be a test in itself. Eventually, sleep returned. Not naturally, but from exhaustion. Morning came without explanation. In the kitchen, nothing appeared disturbed. The coffee maker sat where it always did. The counter was clean, the trash untouched, but the welcome mat by the back door had shifted. Only a few inches. Not enough to notice unless you knew exactly how it sat every other day of the year. I crouched and pressed it flat again, aware of how absurd that gesture felt, as if correcting it might undo whatever had caused it to move. I checked the lock. It was secured. Just slightly farther to the right than I usually turned it. Someone else's pressure. I spent the morning trying to explain things away. You do that when logic lags behind instinct. You tell yourself stories that soften what your body already knows. You remind yourself of age, of stress, of imagination. You think of anything except the simplest explanation. By afternoon, I had almost convinced myself. Almost. That's when my daughter called again. Her tone was different this time. Concerned, but not alarmed. Careful, but not curious. Daniel says you didn't answer the door yesterday, she said. I wasn't home, I replied. He thought he heard movement inside. I closed my eyes. That was new. Why was he there? I asked. A pause, just long enough to be noticed. He worries about you, she said again, as if repetition might transform the phrase into truth. You know how attentive he is. Attentive. The word slid into place beside observant and checking and helpful. None of them were wrong. That was the danger. I didn't ask him to stop by, I said. Well, she replied lightly, you never do. He just wants to make sure everything's okay. I didn't respond. Silence is uncomfortable for people who rely on reassurance. She filled it quickly. You've seemed a little on edge lately, she added. Maybe you're just noticing things more. There it was. The beginning of a narrative that did not include intrusion. That included me as the variable instead. That evening, I returned earlier than usual, not intentionally, just instinct. The moment I opened the back door, I knew. The air had shifted. Not stale, not cold. Occupied. I stood in the doorway longer than necessary, listening to the way sound behaved inside a space that had recently held another body. Nothing moved, but the faint smell of soap I didn't use lingered in the hallway bathroom. Clean, sharp, masculine. He hadn't been careful. He hadn't needed to be. In the bedroom, the bedspread was smooth. Too smooth. I never made it that way unless someone was coming over, and no one was. I sat down slowly, feeling something harden inside my chest. Not fear, not yet. Recognition. This wasn't someone passing through. This was someone settling. I remembered the first time he'd walked into my house without knocking, how he'd laughed it off, how I'd laughed with him. Family does that, we tell ourselves. They skip formality. They move freely. We call it closeness. We don't call it entitlement. Over the next few days, I tested something. I changed my routine. Left earlier, returned later, stayed out longer than usual. Each time, something inside the house shifted. Never dramatically, never destructively. A window latch slightly misaligned. A chair turned at a different angle. A lamp unplugged. Only on days I was gone. Never when I stayed home. The conclusion arrived quietly and stayed. Someone knew exactly when the house was empty. I stopped sleeping well, not because I heard footsteps, but because I anticipated them. At night, my thoughts replayed conversations I had dismissed, moments that had felt harmless because they wore familiar faces. I realized something then that chilled me more than any sound. If I confronted him, he would deny it, and my daughter would want to believe him. That understanding isolated me more completely than fear ever could. It happened on a Thursday. I returned from the store 10 minutes earlier than planned. I hadn't intended to. I simply felt tired. As I turned into the driveway, my stomach tightened. The back door wasn't open. It wasn't closed. It was resting, waiting. I stayed in the car with the engine off, hands steady on the wheel, listening to my own breath. Nothing moved. After several minutes, I drove away again. That decision, leaving without checking, changed something in me. It told me I was no longer interested in confirmation. I was interested in control. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and looked around as if seeing the room for the first time. Every surface held memory. Every doorway held assumption. I understood then that the house itself was no longer neutral. It had become a shared space without my consent. And shared spaces require boundaries. By the end of the week, denial had exhausted itself. I didn't need proof anymore. I needed strategy. I knew, without doubt, that whatever came next would not resolve itself quietly. Someone who enters your home without permission doesn't stop because you ask them to. They stop when access is removed, or when they are seen. The feeling didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in over several days, subtle enough that I might have ignored it if I hadn't already been paying attention. A sense, not of being followed exactly, but of being accounted for, as if my movements were no longer private decisions, but entries on a list someone else was quietly updating. I stopped humming when I cooked. I lowered the volume on the television without remembering why. My body had started behaving as though someone might be listening. That realization landed heavier than any physical evidence. I began documenting. Not dramatically, not obsessively, just enough to establish sequence, dates, times, small details that might have looked meaningless to anyone else. The position of a chair, the state of a window latch, the faint smell that appeared only when I had been gone for several hours. Patterns emerged quickly. Whatever he was doing, he did it confidently, but not carelessly, until he did. I found it on a Tuesday afternoon, folded once, placed beneath a stack of unopened mail on the dining table, almost invisible unless you knew to look for disruption rather than absence. A gas station receipt, late-night timestamp. The address was less than 5 minutes from my house. I stared at it for a long time, not because it surprised me, but because it irritated me. Carelessness is arrogance's final stage. I photographed it carefully, then slid it into a folder I hadn't used in years. For the first time, I allowed myself a thin, controlled satisfaction. He was getting comfortable. When my daughter came by later that week, she didn't bring her children. That alone told me something had shifted. She sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't asked for, eyes avoiding the places where evidence lived. "Daniel thinks you should see someone," she said finally. I didn't respond. "A doctor," she clarified. "Or maybe talk to someone. He's worried you're misinterpreting things." There it was again, the story rewriting itself. "He hasn't been misinterpreting anything," I replied calmly. "He's been entering my house." She shook her head quickly, as if physical movement might dislodge the idea before it settled. "He would never," she said. "He wouldn't risk—" "What?" I asked softly. "Being caught? Or being questioned?" Her silence was not agreement. It was fear. "What did you tell him about my schedule?" I asked. Her eyes lifted sharply. "Nothing important," she said too quickly. "Just general things." General things. The phrase echoed. That night, I lay awake thinking about all the general things I had once shared freely. Walk times, errand routines, which nights I stayed in, which ones I didn't. I understood then that danger doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from convenience. The following weekend, I stayed home. All day. I canceled plans, ignored errands, let the house sit with me inside it, unmoving. Nothing happened. No sounds, no shifts, no disturbances. The moment I left the next morning, everything changed. I returned 2 hours later to find the upstairs window open. Not wide, just enough. That was when certainty replaced suspicion. He was watching the house, waiting for confirmation. It's strange how quickly a place can stop feeling like shelter. The walls remained. The roof did its job. The locks still turned. But something essential had been compromised. Privacy isn't just about being unseen, it's about not being anticipated. And I was being anticipated. I realized then that confronting him would accomplish nothing. He would deny it smoothly. My daughter would want to believe him. The family would fracture, not because of what he'd done, but because of how quietly he'd done it. The truth would be treated as inconvenience. I refused to let that happen. It almost ended differently. One evening, I returned home unexpectedly and heard movement upstairs. Not footsteps. Breathing. I stood frozen at the base of the staircase, keys still in my hand, pulse steady enough to surprise me. The sound stopped. Seconds passed. Then I heard the bathroom door close. Slowly, deliberately. I didn't go up. I didn't call out. I left. That was the moment fear finally arrived, not as panic, but as instruction. Leave now. 2 days later, I found something that removed all remaining doubt. A note, not written, typed, left on my desk, unhidden. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't apologetic. It was familiar. A reminder about a utility bill I had already paid. The message was clear in its casualness. I am still here. I belong here. He had crossed the line from secrecy into assertion. And assertion always precedes collapse. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Not because I was afraid, because I was planning. I understood something fundamental then. As long as I remained predictable, he would remain invisible. If I wanted him to make a mistake, I would need to remove myself from the equation. Let the house answer him alone. By morning, the decision had already been made. I hadn't told anyone yet. Not my daughter, not friends, not neighbors. This wasn't escape. It was repositioning. And once I stepped out of my own life quietly enough, whatever he believed he was controlling would be forced into the open. People like him don't stop when access is questioned. They stop when access disappears. I didn't announce my decision to anyone, not because I was afraid of questions, but because questions invite negotiation, and negotiation assumes there is still room to change your mind. There wasn't. The moment I found that note on my desk, something inside me closed quietly and for good. Not slammed, not shattered, just sealed. The way you close a door, you know you will never open again. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in the same folder as the receipt. Evidence, I realized, does not need to be dramatic. It only needs to exist. I packed slowly, not because I was sentimental, but because I was deliberate. One suitcase, neutral clothes, shoes that didn't draw attention, documents I could not afford to lose. Nothing decorative, nothing that would make it obvious I intended to stay gone. I left photographs behind. I left furniture exactly where it was. I wanted the house to look paused, not abandoned. People who believe they belong somewhere grow reckless when they think nothing has changed. My daughter called while I was packing. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. Then I answered. Her voice carried urgency now, strained, sharpened by confusion she could no longer smooth over. "Daniel says you haven't been home," she said. "Your car's gone." "I know," I replied. "Where are you?" "Away." "For how long?" I considered lying. Then I decided not to. "For as long as it takes," I said. Silence stretched between us. "He's worried," she said finally, but the word no longer carried conviction. "I'm aware," I replied. "What's really going on?" she asked. This time, I heard something different beneath her voice. Fear. Not for me. For the structure she had built her life around. "I can't protect you from this," I said gently, "but I can stop pretending it isn't happening." She started to speak, then stopped. Whatever loyalty she was holding onto had begun to fracture, but not cleanly. Not yet. I didn't push. Truth doesn't need help once it starts moving. I left the house just after dusk. No headlights until I reached the corner. No hesitation in the driveway. I locked the door carefully, deliberately, the way you do when you want a habit to remain unquestioned. I did not leave a note. Notes imply explanation. Explanation invites argument. I learned later that he came by the very next day. At first, cautiously. He stood on the porch longer than usual, checked the windows, tried the back gate. When nothing responded, he waited. That was new. Waiting meant uncertainty, and uncertainty unsettles people who rely on access. For 3 days, nothing happened. No alerts, no movement, no calls. Then, on the 4th day, he entered again. This time, without restraint. He didn't search. He occupied. Sat in the kitchen. Opened drawers. moved through rooms as if reacquainting himself with something he feared he might lose. The security sensors recorded everything. He stayed longer than he ever had before, long enough to believe the house had returned to him. That was the moment safety ended, not when he entered, but when he stopped hiding. The difference matters. People who hide still fear consequence. People who don't believe consequence applies to them. When I reviewed the footage for the first time, I didn't feel shock. I felt confirmation. There he was, unhurried, unafraid, moving through my life with the confidence of someone who believed familiarity was ownership. He opened the bedroom door, stood there, waited. The camera caught it all. That pause, longer than any search, longer than any movement, told me everything. He wasn't looking for things. He was looking for me. And my absence had angered him. That anger would not have stayed contained. I did not go back to the house. I did not confront him. I did not warn my daughter. Instead, I made one final decision, the kind that separates survival from endurance. I called the police, not in panic, not in fear, in sequence. I gave them timelines, footage, access history, patterns. I let the story speak for itself. The officer on the other end of the line didn't interrupt me. When I finished, there was a pause. Then he said quietly, "You did the right thing by leaving." I already knew that. By the time the call ended, something irreversible had occurred. The situation no longer belonged to family, it belonged to consequence. The house was no longer a home, it was a stage, and the man who believed he could enter it without being seen had just stepped into the light. The police did not come with urgency, they came with patience. That distinction mattered more than I understood at the time. The officer who met me did not raise his voice or lean forward as if bracing for something dramatic. He listened the way people do when they already know the truth will reveal itself if given enough space. He asked where I was staying. He asked how long the access had existed. He asked whether anyone else knew the patterns of my life. When he asked about my daughter, his pen paused. "Does she believe you?" he asked. I considered the question carefully. "She wants to," I said, "but belief would require her to rewrite too much." He nodded. "Family complicates clarity," he said. "That's normal." Normal. That word again. Always used to soften danger. They did not suggest confrontation. They did not suggest warnings. Instead, they explained something that felt counterintuitive, but correct. "We don't want him alarmed," the detective said. "We want him comfortable." Comfort encourages entitlement. Entitlement breeds mistakes. I understood the logic immediately. He had been entering my home because it felt familiar, because nothing pushed back. Removing me from the equation made the house neutral again, and neutral spaces make people reveal intention. The first thing he did was stop visiting. That surprised me. Instead, he called. I watched the phone ring, unmoving. Then came the text messages, phrased carefully, warmly, just checking in. "Your daughter's worried. This isn't like you." Each sentence positioned him as concerned, reasonable, restrained, control dressed as care. The detective glanced at the messages and said quietly, "He's trying to pull you back into the narrative." I didn't respond. Silence unsettles people who rely on reaction. My daughter called later that evening. Her voice sounded brittle, calm on the surface, fractured underneath. "Daniel says you won't answer him," she said. "I won't," I replied. A pause. "He's confused," she continued. "He doesn't understand why you disappear like this." Disappear. The word was doing work for him. I chose mine carefully. "I didn't disappear," I said. "I removed access." Another pause. Longer this time. She didn't argue. That was new. 2 days later, he sent a photograph. My front porch. Taken from the driveway. Mail's piling up. "I grabbed it for you." The detective didn't even look surprised. "He wants you to know he's still there," he said. "He wants you unsettled." But the photo did something else. It placed him physically at the scene, time-stamped, location confirmed, evidence disguised as kindness. That was arrogance. The detective warned me gently. "He may start rewriting you," he said, "suggesting you're confused, emotional, unwell." The warning arrived just in time. That night, my daughter said, hesitantly, "He thinks you might be overwhelmed, that maybe you're misreading things." I didn't react. "Did he say that?" I asked. "Yes." "Did you believe him?" Her silence answered before her voice did. "I didn't know what to think," she said. That was the crack. Not belief, but doubt. 3 nights later, the security alert triggered. Back door, kitchen, hallway. He was inside. This time the movement was faster, less cautious. The detective texted only one line. "He's escalating. Escalation is never loud at first. It's confident." After the second entry, the police stopped treating his behavior as opportunistic. They began treating it as directional. That distinction mattered. Opportunistic behavior reacts to circumstances. Directional behavior moves toward an outcome. The detective explained it without flourish. "He's not checking anymore," he said. "He's positioning." Positioning implies future use. Positioning implies ownership that has not yet been granted. The first clear theory emerged from a place I hadn't expected. My daughter's marriage? The detective asked questions she had never been asked before. Not accusations, not insinuations, just neutral inquiries that forced sequence into focus. When did arguments begin? When did privacy erode? When did decisions stop feeling mutual? She answered slowly, often stopping to reconsider. "It wasn't sudden," she said finally. "It was gradual. He started anticipating things, deciding for us before I realized there was a choice. Anticipation is a quiet form of control. It removes decision-making without confrontation." The detective leaned back slightly. "This house," he said, gesturing toward the folder of photographs, "represents something stable to him, a place where he's never been questioned." That sentence landed with weight. "He wasn't entering because it was empty," he continued. "He was entering because it accepted him." The realization reframed everything. My home wasn't a target of convenience. It was a fallback position, a place he could retreat to if the structure of his life elsewhere began to collapse. My daughter went very still. "You think he was planning to stay there," she said. The detective didn't soften it. "Yes." The word settled into the room. Not visit, not check on. Stay. That was the midpoint shift. The break-ins weren't isolated events. They were rehearsal. Later that evening, my daughter sat with me in silence for a long time before she spoke again. "There were moments," she said slowly, "when he talked about your house like it was available." I waited. He'd say things like, "If anything ever happened, we'd make sure it was taken care of." Or, "Your mom wouldn't mind." She shook her head. "I thought he meant helping you." That's how entitlement hides. It borrows the language of responsibility. The police reviewed his phone records more closely. Not for explicit threats. There were none. But for habit. What they found was meticulous. Notes saved under neutral titles. Reminders that coincided with my routines. Photographs taken from angles that suggested familiarity rather than surveillance. He wasn't stalking in the way people expect, the detective said. He was cataloging. Cataloging implies intent without urgency. It implies someone who believes time is on their side. My daughter's guilt shifted from shame to anger. Not outwardly, not explosively, inwardly. "I defended him," she said one night. "I defended him against you." "You defended the version of him you needed to believe in," I replied. "But I didn't listen," she said. "I explained things away before I examined them." That was the more painful truth. Silence doesn't just protect the aggressor. It trains everyone else to doubt themselves. That same night, he escalated. The text message arrived without pretense. You can't do this. This is going too far. Not please. Not let's talk. You can't. Authority asserted where none existed. The detective read it once and nodded. There it is, he said. That's entitlement dropping the mask. He turned to her next. Not with anger, with disappointment. She showed me the messages later, hands shaking slightly. I never thought you'd side with her. You know I was just trying to help. This is getting out of control. Classic redirection, shift blame, invoke loyalty, reframe consequences as chaos caused by others. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she deleted them. That small act mattered. The next entry was unlike the others. He didn't search. He didn't test. He settled. The security feed showed him carrying bags inside. Groceries, clothing, personal items. He moved with intention. He wasn't checking whether the house would accept him. He had decided it already had. The detective watched the footage twice. Then he said something quietly that shifted the entire story. He's not afraid of being caught. That was the midpoint truth. Fear had been replaced by certainty. Certainty that familiarity would protect him. Certainty that family would intervene. Certainty that politeness would slow consequence. That certainty would undo him. My daughter didn't hesitate this time. He's not allowed back, she said firmly. Anywhere near you. It was the first time she spoke without qualification. Not maybe, not if, not allowed. That sentence marked her exit from denial. The police adjusted accordingly. No warnings, no confrontations. They let him continue believing the house was his. Because people who believe something belongs to them always reveal the most. Once he decided the house was his, everything about his behavior changed. There was no longer hesitation in the footage, no testing of locks, no pauses in hallways as if weighing options. He moved through the rooms with the confidence of someone who believed the question of permission had already been settled. The detective watched the feed in silence. Now he's dangerous, he said finally. Not because he was violent, because he was certain. Certainty erodes caution faster than anger ever does. He began staying longer. The logs showed hours, not minutes. Lights turned on upstairs. The television flickered on late at night. He opened cabinets, rearranged shelves, made himself comfortable in ways that no longer pretended innocence. He was occupying the space, claiming it through repetition. This is the point where entitlement becomes possession, the detective said. And possession doesn't tolerate interruption. That sentence settled heavily in my chest. Because interruption was coming. He called my daughter repeatedly, not angrily, not pleading, patiently, as though waiting for reason to return to her. She showed me the call log one afternoon. Missed calls stacked neatly, evenly spaced, as if designed not to look obsessive. He says you've turned me against him, she said quietly. What do you think? I asked. She didn't answer right away. I think, she said slowly, that he doesn't understand that I can see now. That was the first time she spoke with certainty of her own. Not defensiveness, not explanation, recognition. He shifted tactics again. When guilt stopped working, he reached for authority. A message arrived late one night. This has gone far enough. You're making things difficult for everyone. Not concern, not apology, instruction. The detective nodded when he read it. He's trying to reassert hierarchy, he said. That's usually the last move before collapse, because hierarchy requires agreement, and agreement had been withdrawn. They didn't warn him. They didn't knock. They waited. Waiting is the most unnerving thing you can do to someone who believes they control timing. They monitored patterns, logged movements, let him believe the house had accepted him fully. Comfort deepened. Mistakes multiplied. It happened on a Tuesday. The feed showed him entering with grocery bags. He placed them on the counter, took his time unpacking, turned on music softly, not loud enough to disturb neighbors, but loud enough to fill the silence. He cooked. That detail mattered. Cooking implies intention to stay, to inhabit, to normalize. The detective leaned forward slightly. "This is it," he said. He went upstairs, entered the bedroom, stood there longer than before, not searching, waiting. The camera caught his posture, relaxed, expectant, as if someone might arrive at any moment. That pause sent a chill through me, because it confirmed what we had all avoided saying out loud. He believed I would return, that the house would draw me back, that familiarity would override fear. When my daughter saw that footage, something inside her shifted permanently. "He thought you'd come back," she said, her voice flat. "He thought the house would bring you to him." "Yes," I replied. "That's why leaving was the only option." She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She said, "I'm done protecting him." That sentence ended her marriage more decisively than any court document ever could. They still didn't intervene. That surprised me. But the detective explained. "Right now, he believes he's safe," he said, "and that belief will make him sloppy." Sloppy people reveal everything. He started bringing personal items, clothes, shoes, toiletries. He placed them carefully in drawers. My drawers. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was settling, and settlement creates evidence that cannot be explained away. That night, I received one final message. "You can't keep running. We need to talk." Not a request, a demand. I handed the phone to the detective without responding. He read it once. Then he stood. "All right," he said. "Now we move." The arrest did not arrive with relief. That surprised me. For weeks, my body had existed in a state of preparation, listening, anticipating, adjusting. I had imagined that once he was removed from the house, something inside me would release all at once. That fear would drain away like water from an open valve. Instead, what followed was stillness. Not peace, not closure. Stillness with edges. The detective's message arrived without ceremony. "He's in custody. You're safe for now." For now. Those words lingered longer than the rest. Safety, I had learned, was not a switch you flipped. It was something your nervous system needed time to accept. I stayed where I was that night. I did not return home. I did not rush to reclaim anything. The house had been violated too thoroughly to be treated casually. Some places need to cool down before they can be entered again. In the days that followed, I noticed how deeply the experience had settled into me. I paused before answering knocks that came from neighbors I recognized. I flinched at ordinary sounds, a dropped object, a car door closing too hard. Sleep arrived in fragments, interrupted not by dreams, but by awareness. Fear doesn't always announce itself as terror. Sometimes it disguises itself as vigilance. The body remembers what the mind tries to move past. When the police finally allowed me to return, the house no longer felt like mine. Evidence tags marked corners I had leaned against for years. Measurements had been taken not for beauty, but for sequence. Footsteps had been reconstructed in rooms where family conversations once lived. The kitchen felt the most exposed. "This is where he spent the most time," the detective said quietly. I nodded. He didn't need to explain why. The kitchen had always been central. Meals, laughter, routine. That familiarity had made it ideal. He hadn't chosen the space at random. He had chosen it because it already felt like his. That realization sat heavily in my chest. They didn't find violence. They didn't find weapons. They found preparation. The detective showed me photographs taken from his phone. My street, framed carefully from the same angle on different days. Screenshots of calendars. Notes saved under harmless file names. He wasn't improvising, the detective said. He was planning. Planning requires patience. Patience requires belief. Belief that what you are doing will eventually be justified. That belief is more dangerous than impulse. My daughter did not speak much after that. When she did, her words were heavier, chosen carefully, no longer rushed to soften the truth. I kept telling myself he was just helpful, she said one evening, staring at the floor. That he was attentive. She looked up at me then. I didn't want to believe anything else, because believing something else would have meant admitting that trust had been misplaced. And trust, once broken this quietly, leaves very little debris, just distance. She didn't cry. She didn't dramatize. Her guilt arrived as exhaustion. I gave him information, she said, not because he asked, just because it felt normal. Normal is the word people use when they don't want to interrogate habit. I didn't think, she added. I just answered. I believed her. But belief does not erase consequence. Court did not feel like justice. It felt administrative. Dates were set. Documents exchanged. Language stripped of emotion. Everything moved forward calmly, methodically, the way systems do when they are confident. The detective prepared me carefully. He won't behave the way you expect, he said. People like him rarely do. I asked what he meant. He won't be angry, he replied. He'll be offended. That distinction mattered. I saw him across the courtroom days later. He did not look at me. That was intentional. Eye contact would have required recognition, not of guilt, but of autonomy. Acknowledging that I had never agreed to the role he assigned me. People like him avoid recognition. It threatens the story they tell themselves. The judge spoke without flourish. Trespassing, stalking, violation of protective boundaries. Each word landed separately, stripped of narrative. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. When the ruling was delivered, he tightened, just slightly. A reaction small enough to miss, unless you were watching closely. Access had been removed. That was what unsettled him most. When it was over, no one clapped. No one looked at me as though I'd survived something remarkable. There was no swelling music, no sudden sense that justice had returned the world to its proper shape. People gathered their papers. A bailiff opened a door. The room emptied as efficiently as it had filled. That was the first thing I learned about consequence. It doesn't announce itself as a victory. It arrives like a form you sign. It becomes real because it has been recorded. Outside, the sky looked ordinary. Cars passed. People moved through the day without any awareness that something decisive had just happened. I stood on the courthouse steps and felt the strange emptiness of closure without celebration. My daughter walked beside me, her posture too rigid, as if she were holding herself upright through sheer will. She didn't speak until we reached the car. Then she said, in a voice so soft I almost missed it, "He still thinks he's the victim." I didn't answer immediately. I didn't need her to explain. People who rely on entitlement interpret limits as cruelty. They interpret boundaries as betrayal. They interpret consequences as unfairness. He looked at the judge like the judge had done something to him, she continued, the words coming faster now, as if once she began, she couldn't stop. Like he couldn't believe anyone would speak to him that way. She stared at her hands. I lived with that, she whispered, for years. And I didn't even know. That was the moment her guilt shifted into something more honest. Not only shame for what happened to me, but recognition of what had been happening to her. 2 days later, the detective called again. His tone was the same as before, professional, careful, but there was something heavier beneath it. "We've found additional material," he said. "Related to my house?" I asked. "Related to you," he replied, "and to patterns." The word patterns chilled me. Patterns mean repetition, not a single mistake, not a one-time lapse, a style of behavior. He explained without drama. The phone data, the saved notes, the screenshots. They weren't only about my schedule. They included records of conversations, times he had written down what my daughter told him, times he had noted when I was alone, when I left, when I returned. It was an inventory of access. He was documenting you like a routine, the detective said. I sat very still, because documentation implies intent, and intent implies the future. That night, my daughter came to me with a face that looked older than it had the week before. I need to tell you something, she said. I didn't rush her. Some confessions only arrive when a person has exhausted their denial. He told me once, she began, that he didn't like you being alone. I waited. He said it wasn't safe, that you needed someone nearby. The words landed. Not caring, not protective, possessive. She swallowed. I remember feeling uncomfortable, she admitted, but I told myself he was just being responsible. Responsible. People use that word to excuse control all the time. I didn't tell you, she said, because I didn't want to cause tension. There it was. The family reflex, the instinct to preserve comfort at the cost of truth. And he knew that about you, I said quietly. She nodded, tears finally surfacing, not dramatic, not loud, just inevitable. He knew I'd choose peace, she whispered, so he used it. The next part came slowly, like a splinter being pulled from skin. He used to check your house even when you didn't ask, she admitted. And if I questioned it, he'd say I was being suspicious, that I didn't trust him, that I was making him feel like a criminal. I exhaled carefully. That tactic is older than any court system. Turn the question into an accusation. Turn the boundary into cruelty. Turn accountability into betrayal. He had trained her to doubt herself. That was its own kind of break-in. For a long time, I had been thinking about the house as the center of the harm. The doors, the keys, the rooms, the physical space he entered. But the deeper violation was simpler. He had entered the family. He had entered my daughter's trust and rearranged it until she couldn't tell the difference between love and control. And in doing so, he had made me vulnerable without ever needing to threaten me openly. That's what people misunderstand about danger. It doesn't always arrive as violence. Sometimes it arrives as permission you didn't realize you gave. The legal process continued, but it moved with the same calm inevitability. More paperwork, more procedures, conversations that treated what happened as something to be categorized rather than felt. A protective order was issued, conditions set, restrictions spelled out in language that sounded clinical until you realized it was your life being fenced in. My daughter read the document and looked up at me. I thought this would make me feel better, she said. And it doesn't, I replied, because paper cannot repair what trust lost. Paper can only prevent repetition. By the end of that week, the story had changed shape again. It was no longer only about a man breaking into a house. It was about the way entitlement spreads when it's tolerated, about the way silence becomes permission, about the way families protect comfort until comfort becomes dangerous. And it was about what comes next, when you finally decide you will not live politely inside someone else's control. The final consequences did not arrive all at once. They came in increments, documents mailed in plain envelopes, phone calls scheduled weeks apart, small administrative decisions that carried far more weight than their language suggested. Restrictions were formalized, access revoked, distances defined in miles and feet, words like prohibited and unauthorized printed cleanly on white paper. Nothing about it felt dramatic. And yet, every line rewrote the future. He could no longer come near the house. He could no longer contact me. He could no longer pretend confusion if he tried. The system had named what he did. And naming matters. My daughter struggled with that more than she admitted. Not with the verdict, but with the permanence. I keep thinking there's something I could say to him, she told me one evening. Something that would make him understand. I didn't answer right away. Some silences are kinder than truth delivered too quickly. He understands, I said finally. He just doesn't agree. That distinction stopped her cold. People like him don't misunderstand boundaries. They reject them. The divorce happened without spectacle. No dramatic confrontation. No raised voices. Just paperwork, signatures, and the slow dismantling of a life she had once believed was stable. She moved into a small apartment closer to her work. Neutral furniture, bare walls, a space that belonged only to her. I don't recognize myself, she said once, standing in the doorway, keys in her hand. That's normal, I replied. You're not supposed to be the same person after something like this. Loss doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it clears. I waited longer than expected before fully moving back in, not because I was afraid, because I wanted to return deliberately. I didn't bring everything back at once. I entered the house the way you would a place you were meeting again for the first time, slowly, attentively, without assumption. I changed the locks myself. I removed the spare key entirely. I rearranged furniture not to restore comfort, but to interrupt memory. The kitchen table moved to a different angle. The chair he had favored went into storage. The house did not resist. It adjusted. The first night I slept there again, I woke just before dawn. No noise had disturbed me. No dream lingered. I lay still, listening, not because I expected something to happen, but because for weeks, listening had been how I survived. Nothing moved, nothing waited. The silence felt earned. People ask the same question in different ways. Are you scared it will happen again? Do you feel safe now? Do you think he'll come back? I answered honestly. No. Not because the world had suddenly become safe, but because I was no longer blind. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Awareness replaces it with clarity. I noticed the change in small moments. I no longer softened my voice to keep others comfortable. I no longer explained my boundaries as if they were inconveniences. I no longer ignored unease just because it didn't come with proof. Instinct, I learned, does not require evidence to be valid. It only requires respect. My relationship with my daughter changed too, not in the way people expect. We didn't become closer overnight. Trauma doesn't create intimacy automatically. It creates honesty. We spoke more carefully, asked more directly, apologized when necessary without theatrics. One evening, she said, I don't trust myself the way I used to. That will pass, I told her. But you'll trust your questions now, and that's better. She nodded. She understood. It took time to understand the most important truth of all. He hadn't entered my house because it was empty. He entered because it had once welcomed him. Familiarity had been his camouflage, and silence had been his permission. Removing myself didn't make me weak. It made him visible. Life did not return to normal. It returned to honest. The house held me again, not as a place of assumption, but as a space with boundaries clearly drawn. I planted new flowers in the garden bed where the spare key had once been hidden. I let the stone remain, unmoved, a reminder of what I no longer needed. Some lessons don't require confrontation. They require distance. There are people who move through your life convinced that time gives them permission, that proximity equals ownership, that kindness is an open door. They rely on politeness. They rely on hesitation. They rely on your hope that discomfort will pass if you ignore it. I didn't ignore it. I stepped away. And in doing so, I forced the truth into the light. Not loudly, not violently, but permanently. Time did what it always does. It kept moving. Not kindly, not cruelly, just forward. Weeks passed without incident, then months. The street returned to its habits. Cars parked where they always had. Neighbors waved without curiosity. The house blended back into the rhythm of ordinary things. That was the strangest part. How quickly the world accepts quiet once it no longer asks questions. The house never forgot. I could feel it in the way certain rooms held temperature longer than others, in how the front door resisted just slightly before closing, as if remembering a hand that no longer belonged there. Memory isn't always visible. Sometimes it's structural. I didn't fight it. I let the house keep what it needed to keep, and I kept the rest. I noticed I had stopped rehearsing explanations, stopped imagining conversations I would never have, stopped preparing defenses for accusations no one was making anymore. That's how I knew something fundamental had shifted. My mind was no longer living ahead of me. It had returned. My daughter began to laugh again. Not easily, not often at first, but honestly. She rebuilt her life without urgency, without apology. Learned how to sit with discomfort instead of smoothing it over. Learned how to say no without explaining why. One afternoon, she said, "I used to think love meant keeping things calm." I waited. "Now I think it means paying attention." She was right. What happened to me did not turn me into someone suspicious. It turned me into someone precise. I learned the difference between kindness and access, between familiarity and permission, between silence that is peaceful and silence that is practiced. Those differences matter. They always did. Sometimes, just before dawn, I stand in the kitchen with a mug warming my hands. The house hums quietly around me. Pipes adjust. Wood responds. The same sounds as before, but now they belong to me again. Outside, the street sleeps. Inside, nothing waits. And in that moment, I understand something with absolute clarity. The house doesn't wake before me anymore. We wake together.
Thank you for watching. Your trust, your time, and your support truly mean everything. If this video brought you value, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps this channel reach those who need it most. Stay focused, keep growing, and I'll see you in the next video.